Hey guys, we're going to continue our discussion of the Civil War today. We're going to talk about the effects of the war on the home front, as well as finish up the rest of the war and talk about the effects and the aftermath. Got a lot to cover today, so make sure you're keeping up. Pause if you need to, rewind, whatever. All right, so as the war moves forward and drags on, attitudes begin to change. You know, this initial rush of patriotism in the North kind of gives way to this feeling that the South needs to be punished for quote unquote causing the war. So Lincoln was convinced that he had to use constitutional power to end slavery and deny the South the labor that it needed to continue the war. So what he does after Antietam is he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1863. He frees the slaves in all areas in rebellion against the United States. Abolitionists were upset in the North because that the border states got to continue having slaves. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, obviously. On the other end, you had northern laborers, specifically immigrant populations, that rioted because they were angry about the possibility of increased competition for northern jobs. Supporters, however, felt it would shorten the war, and Lincoln pushes it forward as a war measure. The British were a little miffed because they felt Lincoln should have freed all the slaves, even though he didn't really have the authority or power to do that throughout the Union. But with the war now taking on an anti-slavery goal and strategy, Britain decided to side with the Union. Obviously, blacks are heavily involved in the war in the South. Many obviously African Americans serve as slaves on plantations, which allows the slaveholders and overseers to go fight. But they also serve in large numbers in the Confederate Army. Many are forced to, but they serve in non-combat jobs. Now, many slaves that escape and free blacks already in the North serve in various jobs in the Union Army. Louisiana, South Carolina, Kansas all have segregated units called contraband units where escaped slaves serve in the Union Army. Of course, free blacks also join northern regiments, the most famous of which is the 54th Massachusetts. And blacks almost overwhelmingly are lauded for their bravery in combat and their positive service. And by the end of the war, 180,000 blacks served in the Union armies, taking part in over 200 battles, and more than 38,000 died serving the Union. You could probably add another large number, tens of thousands, that served for the Confederate Army as well. Life in the military was difficult. Disease was responsible for most deaths, more than combat wounds. Epidemics would sweep through the camps periodically, and people like Clara Barton worked to improve those conditions by establishing commissions to study sanitation. There was crowding, muddy or dusty depending on the weather, and though camp rations were good, while they were on the move they had a bare bones ration of hardtack, it was like a hard cracker, and coffee. Prison camps were atrocious at the time, specifically after the exchanges stopped in 1863. The most notorious, of course, were Andersonville, which was a southern camp, and then Elmira, which was a northern camp. The people were treated, the pictures from those places are similar to ones you see from the Holocaust, concentration camps during the Holocaust. Life on the home front was very difficult for Southerners. Food shortages, few factories, production drops dramatically of the war, and also the war is fought on credit. So you have inflation, very high prices. And the high prices and the food shortage lead to lots of unrest and even food riots. And sometimes soldiers who are very patriotic desert the army to go take care of their families. So the Confederacy, trying to maintain its fighting force, does institute a draft. And Confederate Congress in April 1862 institutes the first military draft in American history. And of course, this draft completely contradicts the whole purpose of the Confederacy, to not have a powerful federal government, and as a result, governors of Georgia and North Carolina actually tried to block the draft. And also slaveholders were exempted from the draft. So the wealthy kind of get out of it, much like we'll see in the North. Some areas had to be placed under martial law because of violence and protests. Now, in the North, they're not really dealing with food shortages, but more soldiers were needed. And the Union draft allowed the wealthy to hire somebody to take their place or to pay a $300 fee to get out of it. So therefore, if you couldn't afford a $300, you got drafted. And as a result, these anti-draft riots rose up in northern cities, and it fuels this existing anti-war movement led by peace Democrats or Copperheads, these Democrats who wanted to end the war. Some people opposed the war or the draft or emancipation, but Lincoln had many of them arrested and jailed. He suspended the right of habeas corpus, which basically guarantees that you be notified of the charges against you and that you can you get a speedy trial. Women on both sides become involved. Southern women specifically will spy for the Confederacy. They'll run farms, stores, plantations, working in factories to make ammunition or uniforms. Many form societies to roll bandages, make shirts, bedclothes, and many act as volunteer nurses before the Confederacy started actually paying nurses. In the North, you had the same types of activities. Women stepped into men's jobs, produced food with the aid of new farm equipment. You had female teachers after the war that go south to teach slaves. And these women also become the first to hold clerical jobs in the federal government. And finally, of course, they serve as nurses in the Union Army. One often overlooked aspect of the war is the naval war. The South had blockade runners trying to trade and get through the Union line, so you had all these battles. And you also had development of naval warfare into the period for the ironclads. Merrimack and the Monitor fought the first battle between two ironclads, and even though it was a draw, it does change naval warfare. Confederates don't have a strong enough navy to go toe-to-toe with the Union, so they use raiders. They have 29 raider ships roaming the oceans throughout the world, raiding Union merchant ships. Now, west of the Mississippi and the territories and those new states, the war is going to have impacts as well. Kansas was admitted as a free state in 1861, and 6 more western territories were added at that time. So the United States becomes definitely more Union during that time. The draft wasn't enforced in the West, but California did supply a number of volunteers and, of course, vast amounts of silver and gold. We did have the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which actually just kind of secured the West for the Union throughout the war. Predictably, Native Americans were were divided by the war. Some supported one, some supported the other, some didn't support either. But many Native Americans did fight on both sides. In fact, the last Confederate general to surrender was a Cherokee leader named Stand-Watie. During the mid-phase of the war, the Confederacy kind of hits its high tide. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Joseph Hooker was in command of the Union Army, and Lee outclassed him totally. He sent Stonewall Jackson a surprise attack, and it almost destroyed the entire Union Army the next day. This was Lee's greatest victory. He defeated a force twice his size and became more determined to invade the North again. Lee marched north, and Lincoln replaced Hooker with General George Meade. Confederates were on the lookout for a rumored shoe supply, skirmished with the Union cavalry, and both sides rushed troops to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So it really was a skirmish that started over shoes, Gettysburg was. So Lee was a little overconfident after his victory at Chancellorsville and pushed his troops into battle against the advice of some of his generals. He had also lost Stonewall Jackson after the Battle of Chancellorsville when he was accidentally shot by some of his own soldiers. So anyway, the Gettysburg turned with the Pickett's charge. Lee sent a charge against the Union lines, and it was demolished by the Union, and as a result, Lee and his army had to retreat back into Virginia. And that marked the last time that the South would be able to invade Union territory. Grant wins a huge victory in the western theater of the war at Vicksburg, Mississippi in May 1863. He's constantly he basically lays the city under siege and constantly shells it with artillery fire. People were actually dug into the hillsides to try to get away from it. Finally, after 48 days, the city surrendered, and 4 days after that, the last Confederate fort on the Mississippi surrendered as well. So for the last year of the war, basically the Union is going to control the Mississippi River. It's a huge victory for the Union. Braxton Bragg is going to end the Confederate losing streak at the Battle of Chickamauga, but in a strange way, the Union's loss turns into a victory down the road, because on their way retreating from Bragg's army, the Union army discovers the road to Chattanooga, and they flee into the city. Bragg pursued, but Union soldiers had set up defenses, and the Confederate troops began to lay siege. But what happens is Grant arrives and is able to with his troops, open a supply line to feed the trapped Union troops. The siege was unsuccessful, and the Union wins 2 battles immediately following. And this gives Union control of the railroad center at Chattanooga and allows Grant access to Georgia. So in a way, the defeat at the Battle of Chickamauga leads to greater victories later on. After a string of victories in the West, Lincoln gives command of the Union armies to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant leaves Sherman in charge of the West. Grant wants to take advantage of Confederate shortages of men and supplies and really press the issue. He orders Sherman to get into the interior of the enemy's territory. So Lee, on the other hand, realizes the South can't win, but he wants to try to continue to fight long enough for a new presidential election that hopefully Southern independence could be realized. And he wanted to make Lincoln lose the election so he could get a new president, hopefully better terms for the South. And Grant wages the rest of the war in a very aggressive fashion. He keeps his troops on the attack. He wins the Battle of Wilderness, Battle of Spotsylvania, but huge casualties on each side, specifically for the Union. Keeping on the attack, you have the Battle of Cold Harbor, and you have people starting to pin their names and address on uniforms for identifications, kind of the early dog tag. But at the loss after he loses at Cold Harbor, Grant decides to lay siege to the city of Petersburg to put pressure on Richmond. Meanwhile, Sherman wins the Battle of Atlanta and lays siege to Atlanta's defenses, and he takes the city after closing down the last railroad line a month before presidential election. On the political side, meanwhile, Democrats nominated George McClellan and adopted a party platform calling for the immediate end to the war. And Southerners find new hope from this ticket, but Republicans broaden Lincoln's appeal by picking Tennessean Andrew Johnson for the ticket. And he's expected to lose the election, but the capture of Atlanta by Sherman was a great victory, bumps Lincoln ahead in the polls, and he wins re-election easily, and shortly after passes the 13th Amendment. After the fall of Atlanta and the presidential election, Sherman marches across Georgia in the March to the Sea, and then he'll come up the coast through South Carolina. He cuts a swath of destruction 300 miles long and 60 miles wide. After he takes the Savannah, he turns north through South Carolina and begins destroying military and civilian property all the way. Lee and his small force of 35,000 soldiers are basically trapped at Petersburg. Grant decides not to wait for Sherman's troops to squeeze him. He breaks through Lee's defenses at Petersburg and goes on to take Richmond. Lee tried to escape with his few remaining troops, but Grant blocked their way. And so basically the Army of Northern Virginia is trapped. Surrounded by Union forces, Lee decides to surrender. Grant presents generous terms, basically says, give us your weapons and you're free to go. Grant announced the war is over and the rebels are our countrymen again. News of the surrender obviously brought joyful celebrations throughout the North. Lincoln even requested Dixie to be played at the White House at a party there. The last of the Confederate forces surrenders on May 26, 1865, and unfortunately Lincoln was not alive to see the official end of the war. So we'll talk more about Reconstruction in the next, or what happens next in Reconstruction in our next video, but that's going to end us up on the Civil War. We'll see you guys later. Bye.